Thank you for joining us as we continue to work through our study of what if. What if? The things that keep us awake sometimes at night. And in this lesson, lesson number 5, we're going to deal with something that sort of plays the long game with us. It's not something that necessarily is experienced or resolved quickly. It's the idea of betrayal. The name of the lesson is, What If I Am Unjustly Criticized? That happens all the time. We all are unjustly criticized. All you have to do is watch any major news network and you'll find that we're a society that unjustly criticizes somebody for something. But the tough part of being unjustly criticized is when it comes from someone that is unexpected. It comes from someone that you always assumed was on your side. And then it becomes what we call betrayal. Betrayal. Now, there's a difference between being criticized by an enemy, if you think you have an enemy, or being criticized by just somebody that considers themselves an objective critic. But when it comes home, when you're in a situation like David was, dancing before the Lord with all of his heart because of joy that the ark was coming home, and then out of the blue, apparently, his own wife lowers the boom on him and criticizes not only his action but his motive and throws everything under the bus. That's a tougher thing to deal with. And I want to begin tonight going to the life of David, not about that circumstance, but it was the story found in 2 Samuel 16. It was the time when David was fleeing from his own son. His own son had betrayed him. Some of his innermost circle had betrayed him. When you read the story, you find that a handful of his closest advisors that had followed him through all of the wilderness campaigns when he was fleeing for his life before Saul, they betrayed him. And then on top of that, on the way out of town, it almost seems trivial until you realize that sometimes the smallest of straws can break the camel's back if there's been enough that went on before. I think that's what we have here. Now, the situation is that David is fleeing with his loyal advisors. He's leaving Jerusalem because it's told to him by his intelligence operatives that Absalom, his son, is coming to not only take the throne, but to take David's life. David left town knowing that he was a warrior, and he knew that his best chance was in the field. If he was going to survive, it wasn't going to happen by staying in the palace. He needed to get out into the land that he knew best. He was a warrior. He was a fighter. And I don't think he left town with the intent of destroying his son. We see his response when Absalom died. I think he just figured, I know what it's like to run. And I know what it's like to be in a place that makes it easier for you to run. I think that's what David did. We know that he left a couple of his own closest advisors in the palace to be undercover for him. And David began to pray, Lord, unhinge or defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. There was a great wise man that his words were considered the words of God. And David said, whatever he tells them, confuse it, confound it. That's exactly what happened. But on his way out, David is approached by a little man. You say, how do you know he was little? I don't. I just know in character he was a little man. He might have been a big guy, I don't know. But his name was Shimei. Excuse me. And as David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family, came out from there. Now, get this. David is going through the Kidron Valley out into the wilderness, probably just a matter of hours ahead of his adversaries. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. Now, you've got an idea of his intent, because even as he was approaching David, he didn't wait and get in David's face. He began to curse as he approached David, and he pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. Maybe that's why he was cursing from afar. He knew it not likely that he would get close. It wasn't a smart thing to do. It's one thing to pick a fight with one man, even if he's a man like David. It's another thing to pick a fight with one man surrounded by his bodyguards. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer. Then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, who was known to be a hothead himself, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. But the king said, what does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? David then said to Abishai and all his officials, my son, my own flesh and blood, is trying to kill me. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. Now, we don't know that any of that is true as far as the Lord telling him to. But David had an understanding. This was the Hebrew mindset. What David was saying was this. He would not be able to do this if the Lord had not allowed it. And David knew that he had brought this rebellion on himself. Was David a murderer? Well, Shimei was wrong about that. He was referring, as far as we can tell, to Saul, but David had nothing to do with the death of Saul, but David was a murderer. And David had the ability in the moment of great testing to stand back and say, there may be something going on that we don't know all the facts about yet. That's tough to do. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going through the hillside opposite him, cursing him as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. Now, I have to tell you the rest of the story before I can tell you the rest of the story. We know that Absalom was defeated. We know that David was restored to the throne. We know that Absalom died a horrible death that shattered David. And we know that as David was coming back into town, Shimei went and met him as he was coming back into town and basically apologized. And David seemed to be so gracious. He really did. He seemed to be forgiving this man, and he let him go. But as he was dying, years later, David called Solomon to him and said, don't let him die a peaceful death. Now, it sounds on the surface like David has held a grudge all these years. The fact of the matter was, because of the culture of the times, if David had let him go, but if Solomon allowed him to raise his head again, it would be seen as a shame upon David and as a death blow to the administration of Solomon. So when David said, don't let him have a peaceful death, David was saying, you're going to have to deal with this man because of what's in his heart. He's going to raise his head again. He's going to go his own way again. That's exactly what he did. And he ended up being killed by Solomon, but that's another story for another time. It was sort of like life in Dodge City, except it was Jerusalem. And but we take that and put it to the side, and let's just look at this offense. Someone has said, I think very wisely, in fact, they were quoting Benjamin Franklin. They said, a man, a woman, is fortunate to have 2 or at the most 3 close friends that are friends for a lifetime. There are friends that you have for, as someone said, for a reason. There are friends you have for a season. And then there are friends that are friends forever. Those are very rare. And when you study someone's whole life, if you see someone stick by them in true friendship for a long time, that's generally a very special relationship. It's very difficult to find friends like that. But David tells us how to respond when someone that has no reason to betray us, when someone whose facts are wrong comes to the forefront and betrays us. Because I want to tell you this, betrayal is never easy. You can say it doesn't bother you, and you may be that rare breed that has a personality that other people's problems aren't, don't bother you at all. But most of us, it goes deep and it sticks hard. And sometimes it's hard to let it go. So we have to, number one, we have to understand criticism. A person that is mature understands, they may not like it, but a person that is mature understands that there is constructive criticism. There's constructive criticism. Some constructive criticism may carry with it anger, disappointment, or even ulterior motives. But it's a wise man, a wise woman that can look at criticism when it's truly constructive and say, well, the messenger may not be perfect, but this is good for me to hear. I need to hear this. Mike Bickle one time was so unfairly criticized over a matter. And I thought, oh man, Mike, you ought to file an anti-defamation lawsuit against this person. This is horrible. And Mike Bickle, it explains why God uses him so graciously and magnificently today. Mike Bickle said, I needed to hear this. And somebody said, is it true? He said, maybe 2%. And I'm thinking, 98, that's passing score in any school. He said, maybe 2%. And he said, but if he hadn't brought this up, I would have never seen the 2%. My attitude was, forget the 2%. Leave the 98% that's not true. But Mike Bickle's a man of incredible character. And he knows that sometimes constructive criticism comes even clouded over with stuff. But constructive criticism is a treasure if we can pick it out of the mess. Some constructive criticism comes from true friends whose only interest is our benefit. Though painful, this can be a real treasure. But we're not here in this Bible study to talk about constructive criticism. And the painful thing is there's a destructiveness to some criticism that we need to pay attention to. The thing about destructive criticism, if it's just a total lie, it's easier if you're dealing with that. You just throw it out and you forget about it. But destructive criticism can contain an element of truth. It may contain an element of truth. We're going to talk about the thing called the kernel of truth. But the kernel of truth is usually layered is buried with layer after layer after layer of stuff. And sometimes we never get to the kernel of truth because our welfare is not the concern of the critic. A destructive critic, their vindication or their frustration or their venting is what they're interested in, not our welfare. But from Shimei, we learn that destructive criticism, there's some things we can learn from this man. Number one, when you are betrayed, whenever someone is criticizing you destructively, and I'm talking about real criticism. Now, I'm not talking about somebody says, oh, I don't like your tie. Well, you say, why would they say that? Maybe it's an ugly tie. I don't know. Maybe it reminds them of an old boyfriend. I don't know. But I'm talking about the damaging criticism. Destructive criticism is usually based on false information. Now, what do we mean by false information? Sometimes just plain lies. Sometimes it's just misrepresentations. Sometimes it's an assigned motive from a person. Sometimes you can lie about someone without ever saying a mistruth. I was serving a pastor one time. I was on his staff, and a lady in the church said to a group of others that were praying, she wanted to bring the pastor down. She said the pastor was a godly man. There was nothing in his life. She said, well, it says we pray tonight. I just wanted to tell y'all we need to pray for the pastor. Well, the people were concerned, and they said, why do we need to pray for, well, I almost said his name, for brother so-and-so? She said, all I can tell you is that we need to pray for him. And somebody else says, what are you saying? Is he committing adultery or something? And her response was, all I can say is we need to pray for him. Well, he wasn't committing adultery. He had not done anything wrong except not please this woman. So she skirted the issue. She never said a mistruth. We do need to pray for our pastors. Every pastor I know needs prayer because he or she is just not perfect, and they all need prayer. But she told technically the truth by destroying the confidence of that group in the pastor when there was nothing to it. It's usually based on false information. Here's the second thing I've noticed about destructive criticism. It usually comes when we need it the least. I mean, you could have handled it better last week. You could handle it a week from now, but not today. Not today. Not today. Not this week. The enemy has a way of bringing in criticism when we need it the least. And right on the heels of that, number 3, letter C in your notes, it usually comes when I'm least able to deal with it. It's not just that this isn't going to help me, but it came to me at a time I don't have the time, or I'm not positioned to be able to deal with this. You've all done it with your kids. You let your kids do this, you let your kids do that. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever. But sometimes you look and you say, honey, not right now. Just not right now. We had a teacher in elementary school that struggled with migraines. I didn't know what a migraine was, but I knew it was something bad because whenever she had one, her face was just horrible. And you know what? About halfway through the first semester, she explained to us that she had problems with migraines. And whenever she came in, and she had a wonderful little yellow gardening hat, she said, children, I love you, but when you see me put on my gardening hat, would you please be good that day? That means I'm having trouble, and I don't want to have to deal with any trouble. And you know what? Every one of us, I can't remember an exception. Every one of us said, well, of course. And we were loud, we were rambunctious, we were typical, elementary age kids. But when her hat came on, we became little angels because we understood there was a time that she could handle it, and then there was a time that she couldn't handle it. But your critics don't always do that, okay? It usually comes when I'm least able to deal with it. It usually comes when I'm least able to defend myself against it. David could have said, hey, I've got the records here. I've got the newspaper clippings. You're not right. But the problem is he's on the run. He had to leave all of that behind. He wasn't in a position to defend himself. Even stopping to defend himself would have slowed him down and put him in greater danger. Number 5, here's the thing that really chaps your lips over this. It usually comes from those least qualified to give it. Least qualified to give it. You say, boy, that's right, Pastor. You've been listening in on my life. That's exactly right. Well, okay, then let's begin to head home with this. How do we deal with it? How do we forgive? Well, it's tough because a lot of us know what it's like to just refuse forgiveness. I'll never forgive. I'll never forget. Some people are like that, and no matter how sorry you are, you can't redeem the situation. And the sad thing about that is if you've been the one betrayed, you doom yourself to a lifetime, perhaps, of carrying that weight around. There's refused forgiveness. Sometimes there's conditional forgiveness. I'll forgive, but I won't forget. Well, that's conditional forgiveness. In other words, as long as you don't cross me, I won't kill you. There's partial forgiveness. I'll forgive you because I have, it's like I've had, nobody's ever said this in this church, but through the years, it's especially, I remember growing up, there was a big thing that said, well, I love you with the love of the Lord, but then when you press them, but I don't like you. Well, there's delayed forgiveness. You gotta earn your way back to my favor. Now I gotta understand, we're getting a little closer to truth now, because sometimes we need to let people prove themselves, but we don't hold it over them. We don't make them pay for it over and over and over again. So we don't want anything to do with delayed forgiveness. We embrace what's called Christian forgiveness. Now, let me give you this quickly. You say, Pastor, this does not sound easy. You say, this sounds hard. Well, I want to assure you it's not hard. It's impossible. But God can help us do the impossible. Because Christian forgiveness is based on Christ's forgiveness of us. I don't forgive because I am magnanimous. I don't forgive because the person that wronged me has paid the price. I forgive because Christ has forgiven me. It's the principle of be ye kind one to another. Be tenderhearted. Be compassionate. Be forgiving. Just as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. It's based on Christ's forgiveness of us. Number two, it doesn't wait until forgiveness is merited or asked for. I went through a thing trying to work through. I was a young minister, and I remember I was trying to do it for myself. I was trying to do it for the church. How do we work through this thing of unforgiveness, and how do we get to forgiveness? And I remember one time in exasperation telling the Lord, why do I need to forgive so-and-so? You don't even forgive people till they ask. And this person hasn't asked me, so why should I have to forgive them when they haven't asked for forgiveness? And I worked through that a long time. And eventually, I realized this. Only God can forgive sin, but we can forgive people. Now, we can forgive sin in a technical sense, but I'm not called to forgive sin. I'm called to forgive people. Only God has the moral high ground to actually forgive sin. I forgive people. And only God is qualified to withhold forgiveness until it asks for. I am not. And you say, well, but Jesus, on the cross, he did forgive those. He said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. God sometimes forgives without people asking. No, technically you could make a case for the innocent and things like that, but or even ignorance. But when Jesus was on the cross, he used the word ephete. It's a word not used often, and basically what it meant was, Father, bear with them. Father, keep working with them. Jesus didn't exonerate us by saying, Father, forgive them. He was saying, Father, whatever it takes, keep working with them. Keep drawing them close. This is the example for us as humans. It was reflected by Stephen as he was dying. So what I'm trying to say before we wrap this up is that sometimes forgiveness is a layered work in progress. And you say, well, okay, I can forgive that idiot. I mean, that person, that pulled out in front of me and stole my parking space. Guys, we all know in the grand scheme of things, that's nothing. A stolen parking space, somebody pulling out in front of you, a neighbor that, dumps their cat manure in your yard. In the grand scheme of these things are nothing. And we get so offended over things that in the big picture are nothing. But when someone that we have trusted, perhaps for a lifetime, goes south and that betrayal hits us, what do? Well, let me give you these things very quickly. I think they will help you. Number one, develop a system of coping. Develop a system of coping. Find your recovery pace spiritually, emotionally, and physically. In other words, when you're done wrong, some of us more or less usually need to vent. Some of us, or probably all of us, more or less need someone we can talk the thing through with. But we don't want to spread the toxicity of it into every relationship and everybody we come in contact with. You don't want to do that because you're not coping with it. It is possessing you then. It's owning you then. And it's like I used to tell my little boys when I was a little league coach, one of the toughest things you've got to get a guy, or well, in girls, but I never coached girls a team. But one of the things you've got to get a kid through is, and it's tough, is when they're at the plate and they get hit by a pitch. And by the time they're at about the second or third level, those pitches are coming in pretty hard and they hurt. And you can watch a kid that's just been hit by a pitch. The next half dozen times at bat, he's going to bail out when the pitcher hasn't even released the ball yet. And what I tried to teach them, I didn't use this wording, but I said, you've got to develop a system of coping. You've got to know there's a possibility. You've got to know that it was an accident. You've got to know that it's probably not going to happen again the whole season. And then my own son asked me one time, he says, what if they did it on purpose? And I said, well, that's another issue, and we'll talk. But I said, do you understand? You are going to have 3 called strikes on you because you're bailing out. You've got to learn how to deal with this. Do I develop a 3-second rule, or what do I do? We need to do that spiritually by praying up. We need to do it emotionally by calming down. And sometimes physically we just need to work it out. I've found in my life that forgiveness seems to come a lot easier to me if I can just go work in the garden or take a walk and think it through. It doesn't work well if I don't work it out. Number 2, and this is so anger producing, but try to understand the critic's perspective. I remember one time somebody gave me a particularly difficult time. I was so young in the ministry, I didn't know how to handle criticism. And Ramona said to me, we've been married less than a year. She said, you've always said you will not let the devil run you off from a church. And I said, that's true, but I never said I would stay and be his pastor either. I didn't want to understand that person's perspective. But you know what I find? I'll tell you who I learned this from. She just passed away, Loretta Lynn. And I heard her say this about her husband. Her husband was brutal. Her husband was mean. Her husband beat her. Now, she was a tough old gal. She said, he never hit me once and I didn't hit him twice. But when she went through all the reasons that she stayed with him, which is a little sermon illustration in itself, she said something that was phenomenal. She said, I'm not excusing, I'm just explaining. And when we're done wrong, if we can understand, we're not excusing, but if we can begin to explain by understanding the source of their behavior. What is their baggage? Have I hurt them, some even not knowing it? Have they misunderstood something? Are they an instrument in God's hand to refine me? You may find that you're unable to do it, but try to understand where they may be coming from. Number 3, try to respond with the proper words and tone. Their carnality is not a license for our carnality. Number 4, ask God to show you the kernel of truth. You know, almost always, there have been some times when it was just ludicrous and it was just crazy. But whenever I've been unjustly criticized, almost always, there's a kernel of truth in there. Sometimes there's a bucket load of truth in there. But sometimes it's just a kernel. This is the truth. And they put all this other stuff on it. But if I can have the patience to just look at that kernel, I'll turn out better. But it's hard to do. Number 5, recall times in your life when you criticized unfairly and needed forgiveness. That's probably easy for most of us to do. Number 6, fully commit to forgiveness and move on. Understand that it doesn't mean you're trapped in unforgiveness if it's layered. Sometimes an offense goes so deep, or sometimes your flesh is so deep. You say, okay, I forgive, I'm past it. And you are for months until something happens that triggers that memory again. And then you got to go back and dig through it again. But you're taking, it's like that onion that Shrek talks about. Donkey talks about in Shrek. You take it off layer by layer. And the thing about it is every layer of an onion makes you cry. You think you're past it, but they all make you cry. So fully commit to forgiveness and move on. It doesn't mean you're not going to have moments that you lapse, but just say, I'm going to get past this. I'm going to get moving in the right direction again. And number 7, sometimes you just have to let time vindicate you. You just have to let time vindicate you. But I do have to give you this warning. Sometimes you will go to your grave without vindication. And you've just got to commit that to the Lord. You've got to know that on that great day, He will vindicate us. Which leads to the last thing. You've got to let Jesus heal you. You've got to let Him heal you, because it hurts and the wound is so deep that you can care for the wound, but only Jesus can heal it. You say, Pastor, what if this has been a lifelong friend? Have you ever had a lifelong friend, betray you? Well, again, I want to say this. There are people that are our friends for a season of life. I'm not close to very many of my elementary school friends. I can count them on one hand that I keep up with and talk with. Even my high school friends that we swore we'd be buddies forever. I can remember one of them that we said we'll be best friends forever. And I think the last time I talked to him, I said, I'll see you at our 25th class reunion. And neither of us went to the class reunion. I mean, why do you go to those things anyway? Just so people can tell you how much weight you've gained? I've never been to a class reunion. I should. But there are people that are important in your life in a season. There are people that are close to you for a reason. I've never been in the military, and I salute those that have. But I know men that my brother served in the Marine Corps with, and they were inseparable, and there's still a bond, even though they only saw each other maybe once every 2 or 3 years. But there was that reason, there was that thing that put them together. Coming ashore under fire, it was a situation that they never got past that reason for being bonded. But when someone has let you down after the long haul, that's when you've got to really shift into high gear and let the Lord do a special work of grace, because people will let you down. Churches will let you down. Pastors will let you down. Sometimes your spouse will let you down. Your parents or your children may let you down. But God has not designed us to live under the pressure of betrayal that's not resolved. Father, as different groups study this lesson in our what ifs, bring us all to a place of healing and help, and give us the ability to let Jesus make it right. In your name we pray. Amen.